Good evening. It's a pleasure to see all of you. I've taken quite a bit of bragging because I've taken so long in the first chapter of James. So I promised you Wednesday night that I'd probably be talking about these last two verses tonight so that we can move on Wednesday night in our study of James. But I hope tonight is profitable to you. The passage we're talking about is James 1:26 and 27. If any man among you seem to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Now, we talked last Wednesday night about the word religion that is in this passage. And we pointed out that religion is something that is personal. It's not something that the church does. The church does not have religion. It does not do religion. Individuals do religion. It is something that issues from the heart of the individual. The church does not have a heart. It has a head, but it doesn't have a heart. And so we talked about those things, so I'm not going to beat that horse to death. But I want to talk with you tonight about the difference between the individual and the church. And we will eventually get to James 1, but I wanted to look at several other passages to point out to you that the Scripture makes a distinction between our obligations as individuals and the obligations of the church. This passage, James 1:26 and 27, has been at the forefront of considerable discussion for the last 70 years, while brethren argued that somehow or another this passage pertained to the obligation of the church. And therefore, it justified all manner of institutions that have been attached to churches, including old folks' homes, retirement centers, orphan homes, and so forth. So we want to study it from the principles of the Scriptures to show that there is a difference between the obligations of the individual and the obligations of the church. We're going to first notice some principles in the Scripture from other passages. The first is in Matthew 18, which if you want to turn over there and read, you can look at it with me right now. Here I want to look with you at Matthew 18, and let me get sort of set up here. Okay. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. You need to realize this is between you and him alone. The church is not involved, at least in verse 15. But in verse 16, he says, if he will not hear you, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. This still is not the church. This is one or two more, you and the principal man, the two principals, and a couple of witnesses. And then in verse 17, if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. So finally, in verse 17, we have the church involved. But there was an obligation to the individual in two verses before the church became involved. So there's a distinction. And we've talked about this before in our controversies with one another, how we don't need to get the church involved if we can settle this as a private matter. You might notice another passage, and this is the passage that Matt read to you just a moment ago. in Matthew 5, or 1 Timothy 5 and verse 3. Honor widows that are widows indeed. If any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents. That's not the church. Learn to show piety, respect for your family members who are in need at home. You have a principal obligation. Don't come wagging down to the church and saying, well, mom needs help. What have you done? What help have you rendered? That's the first question. You might notice as well, verse 16. I'm going to back up in a minute and notice some other things in this passage with you, but notice verse 16. He says, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged. The individual has the principal obligation. And then so that obviously the individual is not the church. And so your obligation is, this is down here, he says, let not the church be charged. So the individual has the principal obligation. But I wanted to, while we're in this verse, I wanted to notice something else with you in this particular passage. Let's go to verse 9. If this passage is talking about an obligation of the church, then it really is usually more than most folks are willing to accept. Verse 9 says, let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. That certainly doesn't describe an obligation of the church, does it? She was going to be the wife of one man, well reported of for good works. She will have brought up children. It's not something the church does. She would have lodged strangers. This is a distinction between the individual's obligations for godly works and the church. Does the church have to open a motel and lodge strangers? And then notice, if she have washed the saints' feet, I'm getting too much writing on there. If this is a church obligation, part of, as some churches do, part of our worship ought to be washing feet. You need to come up here and I'll wash your feet. I'm going to have to hold them up a little higher. I can't get down low anymore. But it's obviously individual obligations. And you come down just a little bit and it talks about the younger women. The younger women should marry. That's not the church. They should bear children. They should guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. This is not a church obligation. This is speaking of individual obligations fairly clearly in here. But let's move on to another passage in Acts 5, verses 1 through 11. A certain man named Ananias, you're familiar with this or should be, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost and keep back part of the price of the land? You lied about it. He said, you told us you gave all of it, and you didn't. Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? Whoops. You mean my money is my money and not the church's money? Yes, that's what Peter told him. It was your house, your property. The church didn't own it. You didn't have to give it. He says, after it was sold, you sold the property. Was it not in thine own power? It was under your control, your disposal. You had it, not the church. So there's a clear difference between the monies of the individual and the monies of the church. There's a clear difference between the obligations of the individual she's washed the saints' feet, and the obligations of the church. There's a clear difference between the obligation of the individual. If my friend has offended me, go to him between me and him alone. And only after certain other steps do I tell it to the church. Okay. Let's go to another passage. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. He is the minister of God to thee for good. If thou do that which is evil, be afraid. He beareth not the sword in vain. He's the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore, ye must needs be subject. Now, is this talking about the church? Is the church subject to the government? Yes, I know we own property, and we need to deal with that property according to the rules of this government. But you know, Rita met me at the back door. I had about 2 seconds to talk to her. And she was talking about this hate crimes bill the Indiana legislature has been looking at, considering. What are we going to do if the state of Indiana tells us that we can't condemn homosexuality and any number of other sins? That's hate speech. Are we subject to the government? So that suddenly we have to be quiet about things that are obviously sins? No. As individuals, you may well be. So when you go to work, your employer may say, we're not going to talk about that here. And you'll be subject. But as the church, we're not going to be subject. It may be that you have a job with the government. For instance, Leanne back there has a government job. It's kind of on again, off again, but it's a government job. She's subject to the government in that job. But the church isn't subject. Among other things, here in this country, thankfully, we have an amendment to the Constitution granting us freedom of religion. Naturally, it's under attack, as so many things are, but that's a blessing that we have, and you ought to be grateful for. It doesn't exist in all countries. But notice another passage along this line, if I can get moved. Here we go. I want to notice too, what about my obligations to the family? Are those individual obligations, or are they church obligations? In Colossians 3, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. I think you can sort of see how that's going to work out. Submit yourselves to your own husbands, as it is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. It's not the church's job to love my wife. It's mine. It's an individual obligation. Children, obey your parents in all things. He says this, fathers, provoke not your children to anger. That's my obligation as an individual parent. That's not a church obligation. It's not something that the church collectively is supposed to engage in. May preach about it, may teach about it, may plead with its members to do these things, but the church doesn't do them. Again in Ephesians 6:4, ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, Hillary Clinton said it takes a village to raise a child. A lot of people have repeated that. I don't know exactly what she meant by that, but it's my obligation to raise my children. Thank you very much. And a whole lot that goes on in the village I don't particularly like, and don't want influencing my children. So it's not the government's job. It's not the church's job to raise my children. If your children are not educated in the Scriptures, it's not the church's responsibility, it's yours. You have that responsibility as an individual. Now, we ought to try to help and assist as much as we can. We do try. But you've got them 24 hours a day, and you need to educate them. Let's notice another passage. What about prayer? Is prayer, have you ever noticed the distinction in prayer? For instance, you might notice Matthew 6. When thou prayest, enter into thy closet. That's a secret place. And when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. I believe that's one of the questions, kids, just as a gift. We're supposed to pray in secret. And the church also prays, but how does it pray? Do we all have to separate to a closet somewhere and pray? No. In 1 Corinthians 14, if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prayeth, but my understanding is unfruitful. What is it then? I'll pray with the spirit, I'll pray with the understanding, I'll sing with the spirit, I'll sing with the understanding. Else when thou shalt bless with the spirit, how shall he that occupieth the room, the place of the unlearned, say amen? There were other people present. It was a public assembly. It couldn't be enter into thy closet. It couldn't be secret. And so there's a difference in the commands concerning prayer. And in this regard, finally, let's look at 1 Corinthians 12. And it's fairly clear. The body, the church, is not one member. Each of us as individuals have our obligations to the Lord. But the church is not one member. One member is not the church. Notice another passage, this one in Galatians 6. Brethren, and I want you to notice this. This passage has also been controversial. If a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, there's that pronoun, that's a singular pronoun, lest thou also be tempted. Another singular. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fill the law of Christ. For if a man, singular, think himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceiveth himself. Let every man prove his own work, and then shall have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. Every man shall bear his own burden. This is speaking to us as individuals. Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth. Singular pronouns. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. It's not talking about the church, what the church sows. It's talking about what the individual sows. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good to all, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. These are individual obligations. These are individual obligations. Now, in many cases, the church and the individual work along parallel lines. But the ones we've just described are commands to the individual. Now then, having said all that, let's look at James 1, 26 and 27. We'll read it again. It says, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Is everybody with me? There's our verse. Let's see what's in it. See if we can find it. He says, if anyone, individuals, among you thinks he is religious, it's individuals, and does not bridle his own tongue. Look a little bit further. Does not bridle his tongue. Not the church's tongue. It's his tongue. Keep going. Notice it. Here's that repetition. His tongue is under consideration, but deceives his own heart. It's talking to individuals. Church doesn't deceive its heart. It doesn't have a heart. The church is composed of individuals, but these individuals have a heart. Notice as we go on in this particular vein, he speaks. Come on, move on. Talk to me, computer. Here we go. This one's religion is useless. One is speaking to individuals. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Again, obviously speaking to individuals. Fairly clearly. Visit orphans and widows in their trouble. Now, I commented, I believe, last Wednesday night. This passage is a condemnation of that notion. If you read this morning's bulletin, David somewhere or other, where are you, David? Extracted an old article of mine where I was condemning the institutional notion that many people have. You know, is there somebody in need? Well, let's let the government do it. Let's let the church do it. Let's let somebody else do it. Let's let the preacher teach. Let's let the elders do all the visiting of the sick. This is an individual obligation. And it is not just handing them some money. It's not mailing them a check. It is visiting. It's hands-on. Visit. Let it be personal. Visit orphans, the fatherless, and widows in their affliction. It's fairly clear. Now, there's some things that are not in James 1. For instance, the local church is not in James 1. You can't find it. The local church treasury is not in James 1. You can't find it. There's nothing in this about the church contributing to needy people. Now, there are other Bible passages where the church does have an obligation concerning benevolence, but it doesn't come from this passage. And if we're going to study the Bible appropriately, we need to do that. Well, let's think just a little bit further. Can you have a two-man congregation? Well, yes, you can have a two-man congregation, but two Christians don't necessarily constitute a local congregation. You know, I watched Raymond and Jason play football. You were playing football, right? Okay. They were getting beat, and it was muddy, and I was getting rained on. But they were playing football. Now, was the church playing football? No, it was just Jason and Raymond. I hope they were out there behaving as Christians, although they were hitting people and tackling them, but they were behaving as Christians while they did that. But the church wasn't hitting people and tackling them, or running or catching passes or any of that. It was just Jason and Raymond. So that isn't necessarily a church, it's just two Christians. So that if two Christians go fishing, can we say the church went fishing? I don't think so. A Christian, a single Christian, an individual Christian, doesn't constitute a church any more than one worker constitutes a union. There's no union with one worker. It's just a guy. A shareholder in General Motors does not constitute the corporate board. Believe me, there's a lot of you. And that's you as an individual are not the board. A soldier, single soldier, doesn't constitute the army. And an individual Christian does not constitute a local church. Now, this is sort of an error. This was a comment made. I Calvin Workula. I don't think that hyphen's supposed to be in there. He said the scriptures do not differentiate between actions of individual Christians and groups of Christians. All duties universally bound on Christians apply to both individuals and congregations. Think about this. Now, we've listed some that didn't apply to churches. I'm not going to go back through all of those. But my obligation to love my wife isn't yours. You don't have an obligation to love my wife. My responsibility to go to Jason when we've had a fight and talk to him about it, just me and him personally, doesn't mean the church has to go. It goes later if need be. I have an obligation to care for my mother. Primary obligation. You don't have an obligation to care for my mother. I do. And Nathaniel. And David. And 11 grandkids. But you don't. When we all fail, then you can think about it. The several obligations we spoke of. So we ask the question, may the church do what the individual Christian may do? You know, the woman who was taken into that group of widows was supposed to have washed the saints' feet. That was part of her responsibilities. She was supposed to have lodged strangers. Does the church wash saints' feet? Does the church have an obligation to lodge strangers? No, it's just as individuals. Think about this. This is Romans 13, the first 7 verses which we looked at a moment ago. Can individuals who compose the government do what the government itself may do? And vice versa? I don't think so. You're not ICE. You don't get to do what they do. You haven't been authorized. Most of you are not a soldier. You don't get to go to war. You're not authorized to do that. You don't get to judge people. You're not a judge, at least in the terms of the government. You've not been appointed to that position. You don't get to pave the streets, although someone needs to, but you're not the government. So don't go out there like my wife threatens to put flower pots in the holes or markers or whatever. That's just not your job. And you're going to make an obstruction out there sooner or later. Of course, that hole makes an obstruction, but we're not going to go there. There's a difference, obviously, between what the individual does and what the government does. If one can apply an individual duty to the church merely on the basis that whatever the individual may do, the church may do, then any and every duty of the individual is equally obligatory on the church. You there? Good to see you tonight, Tim. Were you here when I started? You got here late. Oh, you missed. But Tim works at a pizza shop. You still work there, right? Okay. Then Tim works there. He makes not necessarily good living, but what living he's got, he makes from the pizza place. He does that as an individual. Can the church open a pizza shop and start hustling pies out the door? No. But Tim does, can. What's obligatory to Tim? Tim needs a job. And part of that job, or at least one of his jobs, is helping with a pizza shop. But that doesn't mean the church is. Similarly, these kids need an education, right? I've seen your papers. Some of you need an education. Okay. Is that the church's job to provide that secular education? Are we in the business? Is the church in the business of teaching you to read and write? Believe it or not, that's not the school's job. That's your parents' job. And they get the schools to do it and pay taxes and trust the teacher to teach you so that you get an education. That's the individual's job. But it's not the church's job. So whatever the individual can do, the church isn't necessarily obliged to do at all. The church, man, we need recreation, don't we? Every now and then you need a break. I tell you, there's more people in here selling tickets to Disney World than you can shake a stick at. It's beginning to be competitive. But, and they seem to enjoy it. I don't know why or how. But anyway, at least it's warm down there this time of year, so it's kind of nice. But is the church involved in opening Disneyland? You know, we got that grassy lot out there. We can put a bounce house. We can do, I've always wanted to do a little mini roller coaster. And I've always wanted to buy a Ferris wheel. I've thought about that a couple times. And I've always wanted to buy a carousel. I've done crazy things. And these are some of the crazy things I've considered now, believe it or not. Also, I've been big into choo-choos. I've thought about there's track. You'd have to lay a lot of track. I've even talked to people in China about selling. Gloria, you didn't know about this. I've talked to people in China about selling me a trackless train. It's wonderful, and they're cheap over there. They'd be happy to do that. But anyway, a little woman over there writes me every now and then. But so far, I've quit. But this is something I might do stupidly and foolishly, not being a good steward of the Lord's money. But anyway, is the church in that business? Something I could do if I wanted, but it's not the church's business. What about medical care? We've got 2 or 3 nurses in here. You give medical care. I got a friend who's a dentist, called me this afternoon as soon as I got home from church this morning. And every now and then he says, well, maybe, let's go to, I've been to Belize. We're supporting a man in Belize. Let's go down there and I'll pull teeth for a while or fill them up. I don't think he knows how complicated that really is. But anyway, what about that? We could have a medical mission down there. Well, now you could go. It'd probably be illegal down there. Nothing personal, but it'd probably be illegal. But can we do that as individuals? Can you put a Band-Aid on somebody and can you see to their medical needs as an individual? Yes. Is the church got any business of setting up a clinic, the Church of Christ Clinic, the Methodist Hospital, the St. Vincent Hospital? It's not as if churches don't do that occasionally. Well, boy, we all have trouble about not bringing the politics into the church, don't we? Well, why? Why do we have trouble with that? We do it as individuals. My goodness, I've heard you argue politics up one side and down the other. That libertarian bill back there, I don't know. We can do that as individuals. We're at liberty. But does the church have any business involving itself in these political matters? I've had several people offer, nice people I know, who said, hey, John, I'm running for office. Let me come down there and make a speech. Well, maybe it'll be a good speech. Maybe it won't. Be kind of impressive to have a couple of folks that are politicians. Mark's brother is a politician. Gary's brother is not here tonight, is a politician. They'd love to come and give political speeches. Does the church have any business in that? The individual can. I've heard Mark's brother give speeches. I hadn't heard Gary's brother, but I've heard Gary. He gives me some political speeches occasionally. There's a difference between the individual and the church. It's fairly clear. Well, there's a lot of people, everybody's got a lot of guns and are armed. And It might be someday that we have to take up arms against bad folks, robbers, thieves. As individuals, does the church have any business doing that? Guy Wood said that which does not involve either atonement or miracles. The church is to carry on the work of Jesus which he did while on this earth. Well, Jesus engaged in secular work. He was a carpenter to raise funds. It's not atonement or miracles, is it? So if Jesus did it, can the church go into the carpentry, house building, development business? Are you sure about that? Therefore, this would mean the church is to engage in secular work to raise funds. And my goodness, houses are building fast and furious. Let's go into the real estate development business. No. Why? Because there's a difference between the obligations of the individual and the obligations of the church. And we need to keep that clear. Yeah, I appreciate your attention. I also appreciate the fact that I was able to get through this lesson in under an hour. See, I put Honor out of his misery, but Honor, you don't know this, your mother can tell you later. I told Max, when I was a little boy, until I was 9 years old, I slept through every one of my dad's sermons. But I had the magical ability to wake up right before the invitation song. It was just something wonderful. And I could wake up and alert and start singing. I don't know if Honor can. But speaking of that invitation, you have an obligation as an individual. It's primary. The church can't do that for you. I can't do that for you. Nobody can. You remember the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, where the wise brought enough oil for the lamps and the foolish didn't, and they couldn't loan it. They couldn't loan them oil so they could get through the night. Your parents can't do this for you. I can't do it for you. The church can't do it for you. Your obligation to the Lord is yours as an individual. It is now, and it will always be. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, your parents would love to be able to do it for you. I'd love to be able to do it for you, but I can't. I can't. There's not enough to go around. You're going to have to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You're going to have to repent of your sins. And you're going to have to confess Him. And then you'll need to be baptized. And continue your life from there as an individual Christian. Come while we stand and sing.